With each passing year, Spider-Man grows more and more popular. Ever since it first revolutionized the live-action superhero movies in the early 2000s, to some of the fantastic animated shows, then bringing Spider-Man into the MCU, and the new Spider-Verse movies, which are some of the best comic book movies I've ever seen. And on top of all of that, we have Insomniac's Spider-Man series that has quickly become one of the most popular video game series in the AAA space. I mean, Spider-Man in general is on an absolute roll right now, and this was easily one of the most anticipated games of 2023, and people have been eagerly waiting for it ever since the original game dropped in 2018 and Miles Morales in 2020. I was a huge fan of both of those games, especially since Spider-Man was always one of my favorite fictional characters in general growing up, and the games take a lot of inspiration from the Batman Arkham series, another one of my favorite characters and video game series. It felt like Spider-Man, Insomniac, and this formula were a match made in heaven. So expectations for this sequel were obviously extremely high, which can be a very dangerous thing, as people can sometimes project very unrealistic expectations onto a game, and when it doesn't meet those, it can leave them feeling disappointed and underwhelmed. Now, I've seen some people feel this way about Spider-Man 2, and while this may not have been as ambitious of a sequel as I and many others may have expected, this still to me, without a doubt, is an incredible game. It's not quite a perfect game, like many AAA games, it has its issues, but I still enjoyed it thoroughly. Spider-Man 2 has some of the most epic and intense moments I've seen in any Spider-Man adaptation in general, and it may not be the most innovative sequel I've ever seen, but to me, it's still nothing short of spectacular.
Yeah. My senses bouncing off a wall. Evil lurking every day. You don't ever need to go. I can feel it right away. Slim chance beat the odds, but I always find a way. You were never just a nobody. Go get him, tiger swinging up in the way.
It feels like every time a big game series has a sequel, I hear some of the exact same complaints from people. It's not different enough, it's too much like the first game. I mean, it's just a never-ending cycle that feels like it repeats itself with each big new sequel. I heard people saying that about God of War Ragnarok, Jedi Survivor, Tears of the Kingdom. Obviously not everyone, but it seems some people just get the idea in their head that whenever a sequel comes out, it needs to be completely different and innovative, which I've just never understood. If so many people loved the previous game, what a good sequel should do is keep all the things those people loved and just improve and expand upon it. Like the expression, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, which I feel is the approach they took with Spider-Man 2. Knowing how wildly successful and popular the first game was, they knew they didn't have to completely reinvent the wheel to make a good sequel. Instead, they just had to improve on the foundation that was already there, which I feel for the most part they did. There are still some weird choices and small regressions I feel from the first game, particularly with the web gadgets, but for the most part, Spider-Man 2 made a good amount of new additions, especially when it came to the traversal. I thought to myself several times while playing how weird and jarring it would be to go back and play the first game after experiencing some of the improvements in Spider-Man 2. Now, gameplay changes aside, something a decent amount of people were upset at or disappointed with was the length of the game. Spider-Man 2 is actually shorter than the first game. And like I just said, a lot of AAA sequels typically make longer and larger games. Again, like God of War Ragnarok or Jedi Survivor that nearly doubled the playtime of their predecessors. So I can understand why some people may have been let down by the length of Spider-Man 2, especially since a lot of us waited a long time for this game and were able to finish it rather quickly, leaving a lot of people wanting more. And I've seen others say that a game of this length doesn't warrant the full $70 price tag. Obviously, whether a game is worth buying at full price or not is dependent on the person, but I've always been of the opinion that the length of a game shouldn't influence the price, but rather the quality. Now, obviously, if it's an extremely short game, like under 10 hours, then in most cases, it should probably be a cheaper price tag. But for me personally, I don't care how long long a game is as long as it's quality. If it's a 100-hour game filled with extremely high quality content, like let's say The Witcher 3, that's great for me. Or if it's a 10 to 15-hour game with high quality content, like some of the Resident Evil games for example, I'm good with that too. What I don't like is when games fill the runtime with long, meaningless, boring content with the sole purpose of driving up the playtime and player engagement. So I don't care so much that this game is shorter. I find plenty of enjoyment in shorter games. What I do care about though is the pacing, which often felt rushed, especially towards the end of the game, where there wasn't enough time to properly flesh out some of the storylines. The story doesn't drag or delay for the purpose of filling up more runtime, but it does feel like it speeds things along to reach the credits, which is bizarre because you would think after the success of the first game, paired with the budget Insomniac likely had, that they would be able to provide an experience long enough to fully realize the story to the best of its ability. Regardless of that though, I was constantly engaged and having a good time, which feels quite rare for me in some of these larger open world games. Spider-Man 2 feels like a game that values your time and doesn't take up more of it just for the sake of driving up the playtime or trying to get you to buy microtransactions or anything like that. Again, I think the story could have used more time, especially in the final act, but I'll happily buy a $70 25-hour game filled with meaningful, high-quality content over a 70-hour game bloated with boring quests, filler content, and an excruciatingly slow-paced story. But length aside, there were a lot of great changes and improvements made from the first game in Spider-Man 2 within the gameplay. The most notable area of improvement for me was with the web swinging and traversal, which was already mine and many people's favorite part about Insomniac's Spider-Man games. And they managed to improve it tenfold in Spider-Man 2. This is definitely one of the things that would make it hard to go back and play the previous games after experiencing these improvements and new additions. There was also quite a lot added to the combat system, and the stealth had some minimal additions as well, though not quite as much as I may have liked. The story, while not perfect, was still very entertaining all the way through, and it's clear Insomniac had even more resources when developing the game with how hard they went on some of these cutscenes and set pieces. But we'll get more into all of that later. The point is, while Spider-Man 2 may not be the new gold standard when it comes to video game sequels, it still delivered an incredibly fun, action-packed experience that makes plenty of improvements on the series' core features and delivers a web-swinging adventure I'll never forget. Perhaps one of the biggest challenges a game series like Spider-Man has to overcome is creating a fun, engaging game world and keeping it fresh while having to keep it in New York City. Most other open world games can create all new worlds and take place in different settings and locations, but with a Spider-Man game, there's only really one place you can have it, and that's New York City. Spider-Man is synonymous with New York, although I suppose they could do a game in some other city where Spider-Man goes far from home. That'd actually be pretty cool. But New York is effectively its own character in this universe. So since Insomniac is limited to the confines of the NYC area, there's only so much they can change and add in each new game. In Miles Morales, they took the same world as the first game and just covered it in snow to help it feel a bit fresh. But in this game, they took it to a much higher level, as Spider-Man 2's map is nearly double the size of the first two games, with the addition of Brooklyn and Queens, which was a fantastic idea, essentially giving players an entire new side of the world to explore and seeing a little more variety to the environments while keeping the iconic setting in New York, as you can now swing your way through suburbs and neighborhoods rather than just the usual city skyscraper. I also loved the freedom that came with actually being able to cross the East River. It brought a whole new sense of scale to the world, and even though the other half of the map is still the same, it's not like I ever really got tired of traversing it. I think the fact that you're web swinging so quickly through the city helps too, as it doesn't really feel like you're going through the same old areas as the last two games. Maybe the fact that it's been a while since I've replayed the other games probably helps too, but I never really found myself getting bored or tired of traversing this city. Normally, with a larger world, I'd have concerns about the time it takes to traverse said world and all the content within it, but thanks to a lot of improvements and new additions to the traversal, this never felt like an issue. One of the best key changes was just the increase in speed with the web swinging. You can not only straight up upgrade your web swinging speed to go faster, but you also get numerous other special abilities to give you a little speed or momentum boost, including the new web wings. When I first saw these in the gameplay trailer, I'm not gonna lie, I was pretty skeptical about them. I was worried that they would take away from the web swinging experience and be too much of a crutch to rely on for traversing the city, but I was very relieved to discover I was just being paranoid, because the web wings make the traversal experience better in general. It gives you another option for getting around the city, and it's especially necessary when traveling farther distances. They provide a great way to gain speed, they're fun to use, and you can use the wind tunnels to build up even more speed and get to those distant locations quicker, effectively making the use of fast travel obsolete. And even though the fast travel loading times in this game are seriously impressive, I never bothered using it in the entirety of my playthrough. It just felt completely unnecessary when the game's traversal is as fun as it is. There's also a handful of new moves you can unlock through the skill tree that can add even more speed to your web swinging. Somehow they managed to make what I already believe to probably be the best traversal mechanics of any video game even better here in Spider-Man 2. It's such a massive part of the experience, specifically in a Spider-Man game, and when you have such fun and engaging traversal, you rarely ever find yourself bored while playing the game or free roaming. It's so easy to get sucked into the game and lose track of time just swinging around New York. Yeah, it's safe to say this game definitely ruined my sleep schedule. I also really appreciate that Insomniac opted to include the option to personally attune the swing assist in the game, so that those who want a bit more of an authentic and challenging web swinging experience can make it so. The accessibility options in the game are some of the best I've seen in recent open world games. There's also a variety of new swing animations for both Peter and Miles that feel even smoother and more expressive, accurately representing each character's personality and style. It's gonna be difficult for any other open world game out there to ever compete with Spider-Man's traversal because of the natural advantage of having you play as web swingers, and Insomniac's fantastic understanding of speed and momentum. There's just something so fun and exhilarating about swinging around skyscrapers, doing tricks, and trying to ramp up as much speed as possible. I remember as a kid, I used to play with those toy web shooters that shot silly string, hoping I could use it to swing around my neighborhood. It's hard to imagine how they're going to make this even better for Spider-Man 3, or whatever it'll be called, but I can't wait. I think another element of Spider-Man 2 a lot of people were curious about how it would try to improve over the first game was with the side content and open world activities. In fact, probably my personal biggest issue with the first game was the repetitive, at times copied and pasted, Ubisoft style of side missions and open world activities, some of which were fun but often got a little boring and tedious after doing it several times. And while Spider-Man 2's side content isn't truthfully that much better, I do still think there was some noticeable improvement. First of all, the more important side quest arcs, like the one with the Flame and Wraith, were very enjoyable. I loved those missions. It felt more like an extension of the main story than a typical side mission. There were good character moments, and it ended on a cliffhanger, which I would expect to be followed up on in a DLC. I don't really see them saving the rest of that story for Spider-Man 3, so I really hope they choose to wrap it up in an upcoming DLC. Then you have your more standard open world activities like the EMF quests, sand crystals, Mysteriums, Hunter blinds and outposts, the prowler vaults. Most of these were fun, although some I found a lot more enjoyable than others. I personally really liked the Mysteriums and clearing out all the outposts and hunter blinds. As a big time fan of stealth games, I liked the freedom and approach to stealth the outposts offered, and I found the Mysteriums to be really fun, unique, and at times challenging as well. I also like how most of each of these side missions followed a different villain from the Spider-Man universe on like a mini story arc. Sandman, Mysterio, the Prowler, even Chameleon. Now, the Prowler vaults and EMF experiments I found to be a little more boring and tedious, as they didn't involve much action and usually involved puzzles, but at least each of these side missions provided some interesting rewards, usually being a new original suit for completing all of them. The photo ops returned from the first game, which aren't particularly exciting, but provide a quick little slice of life in New York City. It adds a little more immersion and life to the game world, so I appreciate it, because like I said earlier, New York is practically its own character in the Spider-Verse. And you have the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man missions, which for the most part I really enjoyed. These feel like classic little Spider-Man side missions where you help out ordinary people in New York with some lower intensity tasks, which just helping out in whatever little way they can is one of the defining heroic traits of Spider-Man. And I found these missions to be a nice change of pace from the fast-paced, high adrenaline action of the main story. Some of them even had flashbacks with a younger Peter. You play one as Haley. They just help flesh out the story and characters a little more. The one mission with Howard and his birds was especially great, I thought, and you don't even fight a single enemy in it. Just little missions like that is what the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man is all about. Then of course the random crime activities that returned from the previous games. They did add some more variety to the kinds of crimes going on in the city, and you can even run into Miles or Wraith while stopping these, which was really cool, I thought. I still think it could have had even more variety, but again, this is just another fun, quick activity to do that adds to the Spider-Man fantasy, so I won't complain too much about that. So while the side content in Spider-Man 2 is still far from perfect in my eyes, and not quite on the level of some of the other open world juggernauts like The Witcher 3 and Red Dead Redemption 2, I still found a good majority of it to be fun, rewarding, and satisfying. Some of the missions, similar to the first game, kind of get repetitive and tedious, and the game does still sort of follow that Ubisoft formula when it comes to open world activities, but overall I did find it to be a solid improvement from the first game. And with the incredibly addictive web swinging and the playground of New York City, with the addition of Brooklyn and Queens, Spider-Man 2's open world is very enjoyable to explore. I still think some improvements could be made, but it's a well-welcomed upgrade from the previous two games, and I'm excited at the potential it could have in the next game. Perhaps they might even pull a Far From Home and give us a new city to explore as well. That could be really great if done right. Obviously, the setting in New York and the incredible web swinging is only part of the experience and the fantasy of being Spider-Man. The combat, progression, and even the customization with all the different suits is very important too. Starting with the combat, while the core of it is still the same as the previous two games, with that addicting, free-flowing system that originated from the Batman Arkham series, there is still quite a significant amount of new moves, powers, and tools you can access while in combat. They added a parry mechanic, which is always nice to have in games like this. There's quite a variety of new moves and combos within the skill tree. In fact, so much that it can be a little overwhelming to remember them all. But really the biggest addition was the combat wheel, where you can use each Spider-Man's unique powers. For Miles being his venom and bioelectricity powers, whereas for Peter being the spider legs and the symbiote powers once he has those. I like this system. A lot of these powers were fun to use. They each have their own upgrades within the skill tree, making them even more powerful as the game progresses, and I like how a lot of them are tied in with the narrative. For example, Miles getting his bioelectricity powers after embracing the rage he has for Martin Lee, or Peter obviously getting the symbiote powers once he bonds with it. To be honest though, Peter without the symbiote suit does feel significantly weaker than Miles. His moves didn't feel quite as strong or effective, effective, but that obviously changes once he gets the symbiote. But causing mayhem and destruction with the symbiote suit is one of the biggest power trips I've ever felt in a video game. Put Black Suit Peter right up there with Kratos from the earliest God of War games with those ultimate power fantasies. The symbiote abilities are extremely strong and fun to use, and I felt the game did a really good job of showing through gameplay just how much stronger Peter is with the symbiote. Obviously within the story, Peter feels stronger with it on, but the game also makes us the players feel stronger with it as well. One unfortunate side effect is it can make the game feel a little easy even on some of the harder difficulties, but it's totally worth it for the sense of power you feel. The suit powers from the previous games were replaced by these new ultimate abilities for Peter and Miles, and while I was kind of disappointed to see the suit powers removed, as it made purchasing suits a little more important as you got more than just the cosmetic, the symbiote surge and Miles' mega venom blast are so awesome. The animations, sound, and screen effects, along with the haptics in the DualSense controller, just make you feel like such a badass. And Miles' venom blast reminds me of something straight out of an anime. If you like games that make you feel overpowered, you will love Spider-Man 2. Another new addition to Spider-Man 2 is the ability to engage in combat with companions as well. Be it Miles, Wraith, Black Cat, Harry, getting to actually fight with fellow characters felt like a necessary addition, and while not a massive addition, it does make the game feel even more immersive. The dual takedown animations look incredible too. The boss fights are another major component I felt were heavily improved from the last two games. The boss fights in the first game were for the most part pretty fun, but a majority of them felt a bit too easy and repetitive. There'd be one certain strategy or technique the game would tell you to use to beat them, and that's pretty much all you would do. But here in Spider-Man 2, the bosses feel more unique, varied, and challenging. They have more movesets, different weaknesses, and multiple different strategies to take them down. I also felt like the game doesn't hold your hand as much. Rather than just straight up telling you how to beat the boss, it kind of lets you figure it out more for yourself, which I appreciated. Sometimes it does still give some helpers, but overall I found it less invasive. Some of the bosses were genuinely harder, and each one feels more climactic and epic than the one before it. The addition of an actual boss health bar helps reinforce all of this as well. Having certain moves that can only be parried or others that can only be dodged just made those fights overall feel a bit more in-depth and required you to use a little more brain power, having to react with a dodge or parry in that split second of timing. The bosses in this game were an absolute blast and definitely one of the highlights for me personally, especially when they're accompanied by such well-crafted cutscenes and set pieces. However, I believe one of the most disappointing parts about Spider-Man 2 was the lack of changes made to the stealth system. If you've watched my videos before, you probably know I'm a huge fan of stealth and stealth-adjacent games, and I for the most part enjoyed stealth in the first Spider-Man game, but it was very minimal and simplistic, so I had high hopes about this being a main focus of expansion and improvement in the sequel. And while there are some minimal changes, it's overall not too different. Being able to shoot web lines and use them to cross large distances is really cool and very helpful in stealth, along with unlocking multi-line takedowns, but I guess I was still expecting a bit more. Not to mention, this game also removed a lot of the web gadgets from the first game, which I believe was a huge mistake. Shooting impact webs or tripwires, those were some of my favorite things to do in the last game, especially in stealth. And while you still get a gadget wheel to use, there's nowhere near as many options and variety to the web-related gadgets from the previous two games. So with that missing, it's like the stealth sort of took 2 steps forward and 1 step back. And ultimately, the stealth system was still more simple and shallow than I would have liked. Not to say it wasn't fun, I still find the stealth and the takedowns in this game to be very satisfying, but I was definitely expecting there to be more depth to it. And aside from a few small additions, it didn't really accomplish that to the degree I would have liked. Speaking of stealth though, one of the most unpopular missions from the first game returned, and that's the ones where you play as MJ. I do think they were heavily improved this time around. Getting an actual weapon and being able to take down enemies, it feels like a very shallow version of The Last of Us almost, and I do appreciate Insomniac listening to the criticism and trying to improve these missions, games. But to be honest, I still don't really like the idea of playing as MJ in a Spider-Man game. People buy the game to play as Spider-Man, and it feels kind of ridiculous to me that MJ, an investigative reporter, can take out waves of elite hunters and symbiotes, which are supposed to be extremely powerful apparently. I had to suspend my disbelief in a lot of these sections, because if MJ can take these guys out so easily, then it should be no problem for the Spider-Man. It's no hate towards MJ's character or anything like that, it's just realistically she should not be able to take down these powerful aliens and trained hunters. She's got tons of plot armor and it just doesn't really make sense. The little puzzles returned as well, albeit far less annoying than they were in the first game. Again, I appreciate the attempt to improve them by Insomniac, but I still found them to be pretty boring, I can't lie. I understand Peter and Miles being smart and good at science is represented through some of these puzzles, but it's just not very fun to me, and I think the game could just do without them for the most part. As for progression though, this was an area of the game that was given a lot more depth. There are 3 different skill trees, one for Peter, one for Miles, and then one for both of them. There's so many different things to unlock, be it for combat, stealth, traversal, and you can upgrade your suit tech as well, which I loved. I already mentioned earlier how you can straight up upgrade your traversal speed, but you can also apply similar upgrades to your health, damage, and of course all of your gadgets. This is definitely one of the better dual protagonist games I've ever played, because not only does each character feel distinct with different animations, powers, and movesets, but they also each have their own meaningful progression and skill trees. I usually tend to dislike dual protagonist games because a lot of them fail to make meaningful differences and variations to the 2 different characters you play as, but Spider-Man 2 is one of the few games I've seen pull it off successfully. It also helps when you have 2 Spider-Men that are equally likable, interesting, and fun to play as. Obviously, this series started with Peter, but getting a full game with Miles and plenty of build-up and development makes the payoff of playing as both in Spider-Man 2 incredibly rewarding. I think the Spider-Verse movies have also helped Miles' character become increasingly popular. I wouldn't be surprised if we see him in live action sometime soon, with how popular he's gotten over the past 5 years. But of course, one of the most fun and exciting parts about the Spider-Man games is the customization. Insomniac does an incredible job of giving players so many options when it comes to the suits, be it original suits or pre-existing ones. My personal favorite suit in any Spider-Man adaptation is the black Raimi suit from Spider-Man 3, and I was so excited when I found out this game would include it. You know I had to wear that thing for a majority of the game. The only thing that would have made it even more epic is if the black suit theme from Spider-Man 3 played while you were wearing it. But I also really loved Insomniac's take on their original symbiote suit that clearly took a lot of inspiration from the comics. I love the color and texture of it. It looks like it's alive and moving, and I love how it transforms and gets bulkier the longer Peter uses it and becomes reliant on it. There's so many other great suits in the game, well, except for the new Miles suit. I don't know what they were thinking with that one.
So, you finally arrived. What the hell are you wearing?
It's my ass-kicking outfit, bitch!
But aside from that, most of them are great. In fact, there were so many good suits that I had a hard time deciding which ones I wanted to wear. There was just nowhere near enough game to possibly wear them all. Spider-Man 2's gameplay may not be perfect, but there's still plenty of great improvements. The combat is as satisfying as the last 2 games while being more in-depth. The symbiote powers were just so fun to use. The boss fights were majorly improved. There's more progression, more customization, and iconic / original suits. The stealth did have some minimal improvements, even if I wanted more, and I was disappointed about the removal of the different web types, but aside from that, Spider-Man 2's gameplay feels like for the most part the natural evolution and expansion on the foundation built by Spider-Man 1 and Miles Morales. So now, we're finally going to be getting into the bulk of the story, so big spoiler warning ahead, I'm going to be discussing lots of spoilers, but before I get into some of the storylines and characters, we need to talk about the overall presentation of the story, because that is far and away its biggest strength. The cutscenes and set pieces in this game are masterful. Some of the coolest stuff I've seen in a video game ever. The cinematography and the camera work is so creative and dynamic. It immerses you into the action, and everything feels extremely fast-paced and fluid. This is movie quality. Some of these moments look even better than the movies. The Sandman fight, the lizard chase, the final fights with Venom and Kraven, this is all just S-tier levels of action. And it certainly elevates the story and the at times lacking quality of writing. The performances are also masterful. There's not a single bad performance in this game, and Yuri Lowenthal, my goodness, man, he deserves all the awards in the world for his performance in this game. The raw emotion and range he brought to Peter was phenomenal. His performance when he's fighting Miles and trying to fight his inner demons gave me chills. It sounded like they were actually torturing this man in the recording booth.
Come on! I'm stronger than this! You hear me?
Najee Jeter as Miles, Laura Bailey as MJ, Jim Peary as Kraven, Tony Todd as Venom. These performances elevated every scene, and the casting was pitch perfect. When I heard Tony Todd was going to play Venom, I knew they had the perfect person for this role. And then there's the soundtrack. Oh my god, John Pisano. What is there even to say? The OST is a masterpiece. It brought so much tension and emotion to the biggest moments, to those climactic boss fights. The performances, cutscene quality, and soundtrack elevates this game's story so heavily, and in a lot of cases carries it on its back. Just incredible production value all around. As for the story and characters themselves, while I overall really enjoyed it, and like I said, the production value and performances are insane, there are still some noticeable flaws. But as a dual protagonist game, I thought the story did a rather good job at balancing playtime and story between Peter and Miles. It did feel like Peter had the more important story arcs, but he's the one with the symbiote, and his best friend does become the game's main antagonist, so that's only natural. But they still pushed Miles' character further along and developed him as well, with the majority of his story dealing with the uncertainty of his future, and doing his best Connor Kenway impersonation, hunting down Charles, I mean Martin Lee.
Give me Lee!
Similar to the first game, there are two major antagonists, one for the first half, while the other more significant villain appears in the second half of the game. In the first game, this was Mr. Negative and Doc Ock. Here, it's Kraven and Venom. Kraven was a much better antagonist than Mr. Negative to me. He has a massive screen presence, he's intimidating, and he's also very intelligent. He felt like a genuine threat on his own, and this was further reinforced by having him kill off big mainstay Spider-Man villains. I'll be honest, I really didn't think Insomniac had the guts to kill off some of these popular villains, but they went for it. I thought having Kraven kill Scorpion was a particularly good decision because it suddenly raised the stakes and made Kraven feel even more intimidating than he already was. It was quite the shocking moment. However, I don't like that they killed a majority of the rest of the Sinister Six off screen. Kraven kills Electro, Shocker, and Vulture as well, and all off screen, which felt really underwhelming. I don't mind the decision to kill them off, but considering they were bosses in the last game and had some significant presence, it would have been a lot better to actually see their deaths, rather than just seeing items that belong to them and a voice recording from Kraven describing how he killed them. Imagine a scene where Kraven solos all of them. Not only would that have been super badass and way more effective than just a voice recording, but it would have made Kraven appear to be even more of a threat than he already was. Like I said, I do appreciate Insomniac being unafraid to kill these well-known villains in the Spider-Man lore, but I do feel they at least warranted on-screen deaths, rather than just Scorpion getting the special treatment. Kraven isn't a particularly complex or super fleshed out antagonist. He just wants to hunt and die to a worthy opponent who's capable of beating him, but he's such a big presence, he's entertaining to watch, and he presents a serious threat to Peter and Miles. I mean, he practically killed Peter like it was nothing before being saved by the symbiote. He made for a great first half antagonist, and he went out in a way truly fitting for his character, in what is easily the most legendary death in any of Insomniac's Spider-Man games. But that brings us to what the story is really all about. As a lifetime fan of superhero content, one of, if not my favorite trope, is the hero gone bad. I love seeing these all good, powerful superheroes turn bad bad and make some morally questionable decisions. I love injustice in DC for this very reason. And so the symbiote arc is always one of my favorite storylines in each Spider-Man adaptation. Not only does the black suit look badass in nearly every adaptation it appears in, but I love how it twists and slowly purges Peter's mind into darkness, as he becomes more aggressive and starts to lose a grip on those morals that make him who he is. The symbiote typically feeds on his insecurities and worst impulses. It's always been such an interesting storyline to me, so when we found out that Spider-Man 2 was going to be Peter's symbiote arc and have Venom, I was understandably very hyped, as I'm sure a lot of you were too. And the basis for this story is the friendship and bond between Peter Parker and Harry Osborn. I've seen lots of conflicting opinions about Harry in this game. You see, typically in most other Spider-Man adaptations, I find Harry Osborn to be a very unlikable character. He's usually always very jealous of Peter, he's insecure, and he's typically not a good friend to Peter at all, making me wonder why Peter would even be friends with him in the first place. But this version of Harry felt different to me. Now, I do think Harry is a bit underdeveloped in this game, but I still found him to be far more likable than most of the other versions of Harry I've seen. The flashbacks of young Peter and Harry in middle school helps us understand their bond and friendship. Peter was there for Harry when he lost his mom, and they had a dream together about healing the world. This is even better represented when they start that Emily May Foundation. When Harry first appears in the game, I felt that bond between the two of them. I could understand and buy into them actually being near lifelong best friends. The performances really solidify this too. His reaction to finding out Peter is Spider-Man is a positive one, which is rather refreshing considering most people in superhero content get angry or upset when they find out this person who was very close to them was lying to them and moonlighting as a hero. I mean, Harry hated Spider-Man in both Tobey Maguire's and Andrew Garfield's iterations of the character. Then getting to actually fight crime alongside Harry as he looked like Agent Venom was awesome to me. What young boy hasn't dreamed about fighting crime alongside their best friend and having fun while doing it? I got chills seeing Harry's reaction to Kraven nearly killing Peter, and the way he went absolutely berserk on Kraven for what he did to Pete told me Harry was a real one. He was ready to get it back in blood. So more so than most iterations of Harry Osborn, it was believable for me that he and Peter are best friends. I feel like this is definitely the type of interaction I'd have with my best friend if we were both crime-fighting superheroes.
There's our guy. What's the plan? I think we should get him.
And because this friendship was more believable, it did make it a bit more sad and impactful when Harry finally becomes Venom. However, before we talk more about Venom, we have to talk about the menace himself, Symbiote Spider-Man. As I stated previously, I love Symbiote Spider-Man. Everything from the suit to the personality changes and extreme power it gives Peter, it's just such a cool storyline to me. And there are so many cool moments with it in this game. Peter being resurrected, him absolutely violating Dr. Connors.
You're Kurt Connors, a brilliant scientist!
10 seconds later.
No wonder your family left you!
Chasing MJ under the bridge, going berserk on Kraven and his men. There's so many cool moments with the suit that's completely elevated by Yuri Lowenthal's voice work that makes Peter sound progressively more aggressive. The shift in open world music to being more dark and ominous, the change in tone whenever Peter stops a crime.
That felt good.
He's basically adopted the Bruce Wayne philosophy of not killing criminals, but leaving them with permanent paralysis and brain damage. There's even a part where the symbiote takes over while Peter is asleep, like the Spectacular Spider-Man. I love all that stuff. However, this version of the symbiote is a lot more one-dimensional than most. This game portrays the symbiote as more of an evil monster whose sole purpose is to infect as many people as possible. It doesn't prey upon Peter's vulnerabilities or offer something he desperately craves. It saves his life and then just makes him angrier, meaner, and more aggressive. He says that it makes him a better Spider-Man, but it was never really touched on before that Peter had the desire to be a better Spider-Man. Personally, what I think they could have done to make this more effective is have Peter fail to save people. Like for example, at the amusement park. Imagine if Harry didn't show up and he couldn't save those people, leading to their deaths. He'd feel despair and like he isn't good enough, that he needs to be a better Spider-Man and needs the power to save anyone from dying on his watch again. And then enter the symbiote that offers to give him that power and convince him that he needs it to be the hero New York needs. I also felt the pacing of this storyline felt a bit rushed. Peter went from 0 to 100 with the symbiote too quickly for me, rather than very gradually causing him to become more subtly aggressive and then eventually into a monster. But again, this story is pretty short and there wasn't really enough time for it to be fully realized. I do love that it led to an eventual climactic fight with Miles though, and tearing off that symbiote suit with the joysticks felt really empowering, but there's also a severe lack of consequences for Peter once the suit is off. Everyone, except Harry, pretty much immediately accepts the fact that Peter wasn't Peter when he had the symbiote on, and they forgive him immediately. I mean, Peter literally just calls MJ to tell her that he's all good now, which just felt weird. That should have been its own emotional cutscene. But undoubtedly, the best part of the entire game is this fight between Peter and Miles, and then Harry becoming Venom and going on a rampage. This was the peak of the game for me. Getting to play as Venom was just everything. I've already talked plenty about the power fantasy in Spider-Man 2, but man, this was just awesome. Brutally tearing through waves and waves of guards as Norman desperately begs for his son to stop. If this game was rated M, oh my, limbs would have been flying everywhere. But even limited by the T rating, I was still pretty shocked to see how brutal this sequence got. I mean, this was just an absolute slaughter, and I appreciate the amount of depth they actually put into Venom's combat and traversal, especially since you only get to play as him once in the entirety of the game. The boss fight with Kraven is so well done, and it's a crime to me that there's no way to play as Venom once you finish the game, just letting this beautiful creation go to waste. We need a Venom game. But from a story perspective, the design and voice of Venom is terrifying. He is so massive, and I didn't really realize just how massive he was until I saw him in comparison to Peter. I've watched a lot of Todd McFarlane interviews, one of the original creators of Venom, and he often described how important Venom's size was to him. He's a monster, and he needs to be huge to reflect that. It brings an element of terror to the character, which is something they opted not to do in the Spider-Man 3 iteration, but they certainly did it in this game, and from a visual standpoint, Venom looks amazing. He's so scary. Tony Todd, who is so fantastic at voicing these scary villains, is so perfect for the role. I thought Kraven was a big screen presence, but man, Venom took that to another level. However, as a character, Venom is less impressive. Again, this symbiote is pretty much just an evil alien. There's barely any depth to this Venom, and rather than making this feel like Harry, it just feels like a big bad evil monster. Even in the end, they literally showed that Harry is thinking separately from the symbiote and has zero control, which doesn't make any sense to me because just a few minutes previously, Venom is talking to Peter like he's Harry, and they explain it as having a hive mind. Rather than the symbiote and Harry being one, it's like the symbiote is its own separate entity and just using Harry's body. And even though Peter was treating Harry terribly earlier, as Venom, he still wants to heal the world with Peter. I would think the symbiote would only enhance his jealousy and anger towards Peter, making him want to kill him, not team up with him. The final act of this game just feels very rushed and kind of went downhill for me after that rampage and final fight with Kraven. Seeing Scream was pretty cool too, and that boss fight was a lot of fun, but after that it just feels messy and rushed. We needed more time and build up with Venom as the antagonist. Then there's the ending where it seems like Peter is going to have to kill Harry to stop Venom, and I remember thinking, oh man, he's actually gonna have to do this. It's the only way. He has to make this decision, which it seems like he does, but then Miles revives him, which feels like a total cop-out, cheapening the entire emotional impact and moral decision that Peter had to make, because Spider-Man doesn't kill. Imagine if Peter had actually killed him, the consequences and trauma he'd have to deal with from that. That would have been so much more interesting, and it would have given Norman a better motivation to want revenge on Spider-Man, instead of him getting angry at Spider-Man for doing exactly what he told him to do. Maybe you could chalk that up to a parent having an irrational blow-up from almost losing their child, but it would have made a lot more sense if Peter had killed Harry, and that drove Norman to getting Doc Ock's help and becoming the Green Goblin. And then Peter, feeling the guilt and weight of killing Harry, his best friend, would want to give up being Spider-Man, rather than him him giving it up just to focus on his life as Peter Parker. It's just a missed opportunity. All in all, I still really liked this story. Like I said, it had so many cool moments. From a presentation standpoint, it's the highest quality you can get from a AAA game, but there were certain story beats and characters that felt off to me. The pacing in the second half of the game felt very rushed, and it left me feeling a bit underwhelmed and cheated of a better final fight with Venom. Compared to other symbiote storylines from other adaptations, I feel this one was a little more on the weaker side, but even so, I still thoroughly enjoyed it. Despite all of its flaws, I love Spider-Man 2. I had such a good time with the game. My inner child was geeking out so much. I do think a good amount of the criticism it received was warranted, seeming like it may have been a bit rushed in development and released in a less than ideal state with all the bugs. It probably could have done with more development time. I still really enjoyed it though. Is it better than the first game? I'm not really sure. In terms of world and traversal, definitely, but for story, combat, and stealth, I have a little bit of a bias towards Spider-Man 2's story because I love the symbiote arc, but the first game definitely has a better final act and ending. There was way more stakes. I felt they were more bold in killing off characters. Doc Ock was a much more fleshed out and developed antagonist than Venom, and as for combat and stealth, streamlining the web gadgets and removing a good amount of them just baffles me. It removed a lot of depth, and I can't really understand why they would go in that direction. The removal of the suit powers, I do understand because we got those new ultimate abilities, but the web gadgets? Just an odd choice and regression. I'll say this as well, I played Spider-Man Remastered on PC, and it looked better than Spider-Man 2. That's probably just because I played on PC, so we'll see whenever Spider-Man 2 drops on there, but I did feel like that was worth pointing out. Still though, Spider-Man 2 overall is a very fun game. It's far from a masterpiece, and it definitely wasn't Game of the Year, especially with all the other contenders, but a very good time regardless.